There is something almost deceptive about the first image that comes to mind when we think about the Chronicles of Narnia. A wardrobe for children, a snowy forest, a fawn carrying an umbrella, talking animals, a magical kingdom hidden behind an ordinary wooden door. It sounds like the safest possible ingredients for a children's fantasy. Something designed to make a child believe that the world is bigger, stranger, and more beautiful than adults have told them. And yet, the deeper you go into Narnia, the harder it becomes to describe it as a simple escape into childhood. Because behind that wardrobe is a world where people betray the ones they love, where temptation can fracture a family, where an entire kingdom is trapped under an unnatural winter, where children are forced to become soldiers, and where the central figure of goodness is willing to die for someone who has betrayed him. Narnia begins with wonder, but it very quickly introduces consequences. That contrast is the reason the story has survived. The fantasy is bright enough to attract a child, but the questions underneath it are heavy enough to follow that child into adulthood. Lucy enters the wardrobe because she is curious. Edmund enters because he is resentful. Peter and Susan initially resist because they are cautious. For children walk through the same doorway, but each one carries a different version of childhood with them. And Narnia responds to each of those versions differently. Lucy discovers that believing in something before everyone else does not necessarily make you foolish. Peter discovers that leadership is not about being the strongest person in the room, but about accepting responsibility when everyone else is afraid. Susan discovers that skepticism can protect you, but it can also become a prison when fear disguises itself as reason. And Edmund discovers perhaps the most painful lesson of all. A single selfish decision can hurt people you love, but a terrible mistake does not have to become the final definition of who you are. Then there is Aslan. Even if someone has never read C.S. Lewis's books or studied Christian theology, the emotional architecture of his story is unmistakable. He is powerful, but he chooses vulnerability. He could destroy his enemies, but instead he allows himself to be humiliated and killed. The stone table sequence does something remarkable, because it temporarily removes the safety net that fantasy usually provides. For a few minutes, the audience is not watching a magical adventure anymore. We are watching children confront death. Lucy and Susan cannot save Aslan. They can only remain beside him. And that is where Narnia reveals its real subject. The story is not fundamentally about finding another world. It is about discovering that once you enter a world where your choices matter, you can no longer remain innocent in the same way. The wardrobe is therefore more than a portal. It is a threshold. On one side is childhood, where the world can still feel like something adults are supposed to control. On the other side is experience, where love comes with risk, courage comes with fear, and doing the right thing can cost you something. That may sound surprisingly serious for a movie remembered by many people as a childhood fantasy, but that seriousness is exactly why the movie left such a deep impression. Millions of viewers did not simply remember Narnia because they liked the creatures or the battles. They remembered how it felt to discover that a story could be beautiful and frightening at the same time. They remembered the first sight of the lampposts glowing in the snow. They remembered Mr. Tumnus and the strange sadness of realizing that this gentle creature was living under the control of someone he feared. They remembered Edmund sitting across from the White Witch and accepting the Turkish delight, perhaps without understanding that the real temptation was not candy. It was recognition. It was the promise that someone would finally treat him as important. They remembered the stone table. They remembered Aslan's roar. And they remembered the strange feeling at the end when 4 children who had become kings and queens suddenly found themselves standing inside an ordinary wardrobe again, their crowns and weapons gone, their years of experience seemingly erased. That ending is one of the quietest clues to what Narnia has always been trying to say. You can return from another world, but you cannot return as exactly the same person who entered it. And that idea becomes even more fascinating when we step outside the story itself and examine how Narnia came to exist, why C.S. Lewis created it, how Hollywood transformed it, why the first movie became such a major event in the early 2000s, and why the franchise that seemed destined to become the next great fantasy empire eventually became one of Hollywood's most complicated unfinished stories. So this is not simply a recap of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. We are going back through Narnia from almost every direction. Its literary origins, its transformation from page to screen, the psychology of the Pevensey children, the White Witch's obsession with control, the meaning of Aslan's sacrifice, the visual language of winter and spring, the music that taught audiences how to feel this world, the production challenges behind its creatures and battles, the debates surrounding its Christian symbolism, the response from critics and audiences, the business decisions that shaped its sequels, and the strange legacy that remains decades after the books first invited readers through the wardrobe. Because Narnia sits at an interesting intersection in popular culture. It belongs to the world of children's literature, but its questions are adult. It is openly shaped by Christian imagination, yet its emotional ideas can reach audiences who do not share Lewis's faith. It was released into a Hollywood landscape dominated by The Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, yet it developed a visual and emotional identity of its own. And perhaps most importantly, it changes depending on when you watch it. A child may see a magical kingdom. A teenager may see an epic adventure. An adult may suddenly notice the grief, guilt, political control, family resentment, and philosophical questions that were sitting there the entire time. That is the strange power of nostalgia. Sometimes returning to an old movie does not simply make you remember who you were. It reveals how much you have changed since the last time you watched it. For many viewers, Narnia was discovered in exactly the right cultural moment. The early 2000s were a golden age for fantasy cinema. The Lord of the Rings had demonstrated that audiences would sit through enormous stories involving invented languages, mythical creatures, ancient prophecies, and battles for the fate of entire civilizations. Harry Potter had turned children's literature into a global cinematic phenomenon. Studios were searching for the next property that could become not merely a successful film, but an entire cultural universe. And then came a story that had already been waiting for generations. The challenge was that Narnia was not The Lord of the Rings. It was not Harry Potter. Lewis's world had its own rhythm, its own mixture of biblical imagery, classical mythology, British children's literature, fairy tale traditions, and philosophical ideas. Bringing that world to the screen meant deciding what could remain strange, what needed to be modernized, and what could not be compromised without losing the soul of the original. To understand why the movie worked as well as it did, we have to go back before the wardrobes, before the CGI, before the casting, and before Hollywood had any idea that Narnia could become a blockbuster. C.S. Lewis was already a major literary and intellectual figure long before Narnia existed. He was a scholar, an essayist, a novelist, a Christian thinker, and one of the most influential writers of the 20th century. His friendship with J.R.R. Tolkien is especially important when discussing the world that eventually became Narnia. because the two men shared an extraordinary intellectual relationship while simultaneously developing very different approaches to fantasy. Tolkien built Middle-earth with an almost historical density. Languages, genealogies, cultures, landscapes, and myths were constructed, as though they had existed for thousands of years before the reader arrived. Lewis was more willing to let different mythological traditions collide. Narnia could contain talking animals, Greek-inspired creatures, Father Christmas, kings and queens, medieval castles, biblical symbolism, and ordinary children from wartime Britain without needing to explain why all these ingredients belong together. The result could feel less like a single invented history and more like the inside of a vast imagination. That distinction matters because Lewis was not writing children's stories by making his ideas smaller. He was writing for children while assuming that children were capable of encountering mystery, fear, grief, moral failure, and spiritual questions. The 7 Narnia books were published between 1950 and 1956, beginning with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. They became enduring classics, but their journey to cinema was not straightforward. On the page, Lewis could describe a world and allow the reader's imagination to finish the work. A film does not have that luxury. A filmmaker has to decide exactly what a fawn looks like, exactly how a centaur moves, exactly how a talking beaver should sound, exactly what Aslan's face should communicate, and exactly how an audience should react when a magical kingdom suddenly becomes a battlefield. That challenge had defeated or delayed previous attempts to bring Narnia to a large cinematic audience. The technology had not always been capable of rendering the creatures convincingly, and the story itself presented an unusual tonal problem. How do you make a movie about children entering a wardrobe feel enormous without making it lose the intimacy that makes the book special? How do you portray talking animals without turning the entire thing into a cartoon? How do you show war and death while remembering that the central characters are children? And how do you preserve Lewis's Christian architecture without turning the movie into a theological lecture? These were not small adaptation problems. They were fundamental questions about what Narnia actually was. When Disney and Walden Media became involved, the project finally had the resources to attempt a large-scale cinematic version. Andrew Adamson, coming from an animation background that included Shrek, was an especially interesting choice. He understood how fantasy could be funny, emotionally sincere, and visually exaggerated without becoming emotionally weightless. But Narnia required something different from Shrek. It needed spectacle, certainly, but it also needed reverence. The film could not constantly wink at the audience. It had to believe in its own world. The casting helped establish that seriousness. The 4 Pevensey children needed to feel young enough to be believable as children and capable enough to carry a story that would eventually place swords in their hands. Georgie Henley as Lucy brought an emotional openness that became essential to the movie's identity. Skander Keynes gave Edmund a mixture of insecurity and defensiveness that made his betrayal painful, rather than merely convenient. William Moseley had to grow visibly into Peter's leadership, while Anna Popplewell gave Susan a grounded intelligence that prevented the siblings from feeling like 4 variations of the same hero. Then there was Tilda Swinton as the White Witch. Her performance became one of the film's defining elements because she did not play Jadis as a screaming monster. She played her as someone who believed her authority was natural. That made the witch more unsettling. Her stillness suggested confidence, and her confidence suggested that she did not see herself as evil. She saw herself as necessary. Liam Neeson brought Aslan a different kind of authority. The voice needed to sound powerful without becoming aggressive, warm without becoming sentimental, and ancient without becoming lifeless. Aslan's presence had to feel larger than the children while still allowing the children to matter. Meanwhile, Weta Workshop and the visual effects teams faced the enormous task of making Narnia physically believable. The goal was not simply to show audiences impressive creatures. It was to make them forget, at least for a moment, that those creatures had been created by artists, puppeteers, animators, costumes, digital compositing, and hundreds of technicians. That distinction became crucial. Fantasy succeeds when impossible things begin to feel ordinary inside the world of the story. A talking beaver should eventually stop being something the audience analyzes and become simply Mr. Beaver. A centaur should stop being a visual effect and become a soldier. Aslan should stop being a digital character and become Aslan. The filmmakers understood that the greatest technical achievement would be emotional invisibility. If audiences started thinking about the technology during every scene, Narnia would remain a special effect. If they forgot the technology, it could become a world. The timing of the movie's release could hardly have been more important. By 2005, fantasy had become one of Hollywood's most valuable genres. The Lord of the Rings had transformed the expectations for large-scale fantasy filmmaking, proving that audiences were willing to invest emotionally in long stories populated by creatures, kingdoms, prophecies, and mythologies. Harry Potter had demonstrated that a children's fantasy property could become a global cultural institution. Studios wanted another world that audiences could grow up with. Narnia seemed almost perfect on paper. The books were internationally famous. The characters were iconic. The mythology was deep. There were 7 novels. There were creatures, battles, magic, royalty, and a central figure in Aslan who could become a merchandising and marketing dream. But there was one problem. The audience already knew what fantasy looked like after The Lord of the Rings. Narnia could not simply imitate Middle-earth. And its story was strange enough that some viewers wondered whether talking animals and Christian symbolism could really coexist with blockbuster filmmaking. The marketing therefore had to sell 2 different experiences at once. To families, Narnia could be presented as a magical adventure. To fantasy fans, it could be sold as an epic war between good and evil. To readers, it had to promise fidelity to a beloved classic. And to people unfamiliar with Lewis, it needed to communicate that this was not a small children's movie. The trailers emphasized snow-covered forests, enormous armies, castles, mythical creatures, and the unmistakable image of Aslan. The posters often placed the Pevensey children against the vastness of Narnia, making them look small in relation to the world they were entering. The release date mattered too. Arriving around Christmas 2005 gave the movie a family event quality. Going to see Narnia could become a holiday tradition, something parents and children experience together. That was an important part of its cultural strategy. The movie did not need to convince audiences that fantasy existed. The previous decade had already done that. It needed to convince them that this fantasy world deserved their emotional investment. And the answer would come from a decision that sounds simple but was surprisingly difficult. The film had to take the children seriously. It could not treat them as miniature adults, but it also could not treat their experiences as disposable. Their fear had to matter. Their arguments had to matter. Edmund's jealousy had to matter. Lucy's belief had to matter. When these children eventually entered a war, the audience had to feel that something had been taken from them. That is why the opening in Britain is so important. Before Narnia becomes a kingdom of magic, the film establishes that these children are already living through a world shaped by violence. The story begins not in Narnia, but in wartime Britain. The sound of aircraft and explosions immediately establishes a world where childhood is already being interrupted by forces the children cannot control. Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy are evacuated from London and sent into the countryside, away from their parents and the familiar life they know. This detail is easy to overlook when remembering the movie years later, but psychologically it explains almost everything that follows. These children are not simply bored siblings looking for entertainment. They are displaced. They have been removed from home because the adult world has become dangerous. They are living in the aftermath of decisions made by governments, armies, and war. They are separated from their parents, placed under the supervision of strangers, and expected to adapt. That makes the discovery of Narnia more than a magical coincidence. It arrives at precisely the moment when the children need another world. At the country estate, the siblings reveal their differences almost immediately. Peter feels responsible for the others, but his confidence is still incomplete. Susan is practical and protective. Edmund is defensive, easily irritated, and increasingly frustrated by Peter's authority. Lucy is imaginative, open, and willing to believe that the world may contain more than what is immediately visible. The house itself becomes part of the mystery. It is enormous, unfamiliar, and full of rooms that seem to promise hidden stories. During a game of hide-and-seek, Lucy finds herself in front of a wardrobe. She steps inside, expecting the ordinary limits of furniture and darkness. Instead, she walks into snow. That moment is one of the great cinematic transitions of fantasy, because the movie does not immediately overwhelm the audience with spectacle. It gives us a lamppost, a snowy forest, silence, and a little girl realizing that the impossible has become real. The lamppost is an especially strange image because it looks completely out of place. It is a piece of modern infrastructure standing in an ancient-looking forest. Yet that is exactly why it works. It tells Lucy and us that this world is connected to our own in a way we do not yet understand. Soon she meets Mr. Tumnus, a fawn carrying an umbrella and parcels. At first everything feels charming, but then the mood changes. Tumnus admits that he was supposed to turn Lucy over to the White Witch. The gentle fawn is not merely a whimsical creature. He is someone living under political terror. The witch has created a kingdom where fear has become normal. There is no Christmas, no spring. No freedom, only winter. Tumnus's decision to protect Lucy is therefore the first moral choice made by a Narnian character on screen. He risks punishment because he realizes that obeying an evil system is itself a moral decision. Lucy eventually returns through the wardrobe, but when she tells her siblings what happened, they do not believe her. This creates one of the movie's most important tensions. Lucy has seen something real, but reality has not yet become shared knowledge. Her siblings interpret her experience through ordinary logic. Peter and Susan think she may be confused. Edmund knows more than he admits. And that is because Edmund has already entered Narnia himself. His encounter with the White Witch is radically different from Lucy's. Lucy enters through curiosity and discovers kindness. Edmund enters through resentment and discovers someone who knows exactly what he wants to hear. The White Witch does not need to force him. She gives him attention. She makes him feel special. She offers him Turkish delight and promises him power if he brings his siblings to her. The candy has become one of the most recognizable objects associated with Narnia. But psychologically it is almost incidental. Edmund is not destroyed by dessert. He is manipulated by validation. The witch sees a lonely child who wants to matter and turns that desire into leverage. Her kingdom is frozen, and so is her emotional world. She does not build relationships. She controls them. She does not persuade through love. She purchases loyalty through reward and fear. Edmund's temptation is therefore the beginning of the larger conflict. The witch has discovered the weakness inside the family, and the family does not yet realize that it has one. Eventually the siblings all enter Narnia together, and the private fantasy becomes a shared reality. This is where the film's emotional stakes begin to expand. Lucy's discovery is no longer something the others can dismiss. The world exists. Mr. Tumnus is real. The witch is real. And the children are suddenly standing inside a conflict that existed long before they arrived. The beavers introduce them to the larger mythology of Narnia. They explain that the Pevensies are part of a prophecy and that Aslan is returning. That phrase, Aslan is on the move, carries an unusual amount of weight because the children do not yet understand what it means. The name itself becomes a kind of gravitational force. Narnia seems to change simply because Aslan has decided to act. But before the children can reach him, Edmund secretly leaves to find the witch. His betrayal is painful because it is not driven by hatred of his family. He wants the reward she promised. He wants to become important. He wants the others to stop treating him like the youngest boy who is always wrong. In other words, he wants something understandable. That is what makes the betrayal uncomfortable. Edmund is not a monster. He is a child making a selfish choice. The danger comes from the fact that the consequences are much larger than the choice itself. Once Edmund leaves, the siblings realize that they cannot simply walk back through the wardrobe and forget what happened. Narnia's conflict has entered their family. Peter begins to take responsibility in a more serious way. Susan becomes even more protective. Lucy remains convinced that Aslan can help. Edmund becomes increasingly isolated. The emotional structure of the story begins to mirror the physical journey. The children are traveling toward Aslan, but Edmund is traveling away from his family. When they eventually encounter Aslan's forces, the fantasy world becomes militarized. There are centaurs, talking animals, archers, soldiers, and creatures preparing for battle. The children are no longer tourists. They are participants. This is the point where the movie quietly changes genre. It began as a children's adventure. It becomes a war story. The breaking of winter marks the beginning of hope. After so much snow and cold, the return of warmth becomes almost physical evidence that the witch's power is weakening. Father Christmas's appearance adds another layer to this transformation. His gifts are not simply magical toys. They are tools that reflect the children's emerging responsibilities. Peter receives a sword and shield. Susan receives a bow and a horn. Lucy receives a healing cordial and a dagger. Each gift corresponds to a different kind of courage. Peter must fight. Susan must observe and protect. Lucy must heal and, if necessary, defend herself. The gifts therefore anticipate the people they are becoming. Peter's confrontation with the wolf is the first moment when he truly crosses the line between child and leader. He is afraid, but he acts anyway. Courage in Narnia is never presented as the absence of fear. It is action despite fear. That distinction becomes crucial as the story moves toward war. Edmund is captured, and the consequences of his betrayal become unavoidable. The other children now understand that their brother is in danger because of a choice he made. Aslan's forces rescue him, but rescue does not erase guilt. Edmund returns to his family carrying shame. One of the most important emotional decisions the movie makes is refusing to turn Edmund's redemption into a simple speech. He does not become innocent again. He has to live with the knowledge of what he did. Aslan's response is therefore crucial. He does not publicly humiliate Edmund. He speaks to him privately. The forgiveness is powerful because it does not pretend the betrayal never happened. Edmund is forgiven while still being responsible for his actions. That is a more mature idea than the simplistic version of redemption where someone makes one apology and everything disappears. But the witch refuses to accept that forgiveness. She invokes the deep magic and claims the right to Edmund's life, because his betrayal has placed him under the law. This introduces one of the story's deepest questions. What happens when justice and mercy appear to demand opposite things? The witch's argument is frightening because it is not presented as pure nonsense. She knows the law. She knows the rules. She believes that Edmund's blood belongs to her because of what he has done. Aslan accepts this burden. He understands that the only way to save Edmund is to take his place. The journey to the stone table is therefore not just a march toward a dramatic set piece. It is a movement toward sacrifice. Susan and Lucy follow Aslan because they sense that something terrible is coming. Their presence matters because they are not soldiers. They are witnesses. Aslan walks toward the stone table knowing what will happen. The mood becomes quieter. The enormous armies and magical creatures disappear from the emotional center. What remains is one creature, two children, and the knowledge that power is about to become vulnerability. The witch's soldiers restrain Aslan. His mane is cut. He is humiliated. The image is intentionally uncomfortable because the movie is stripping away the visual signs of power that have defined him. The lion who seemed untouchable becomes physically helpless. And the witch believes she has won. She believes that strength means control, and therefore she cannot understand what Aslan is doing. He is choosing the terms of his own sacrifice. The stone table becomes the center of the film's theological and emotional architecture. Aslan's death is not presented as a battle he loses. It is presented as a sacrifice he accepts. Lucy and Susan witness it from hiding, and their grief is immediate. There is no triumphant music to soften the moment. There is a sense of abandonment. The great protector is gone. The witch has won according to every visible measurement. And then the stone table cracks. The deeper magic is revealed. The witch understood the law, but she did not understand love. Death could claim the innocent substitute under the surface rules she knew, but there was a deeper principle she did not understand. Aslan rises again. The emotional reversal is enormous, because the audience has been allowed to experience defeat before receiving hope. Resurrection is meaningful here because it follows genuine loss. The story does not simply say that everything will be fine. It makes the characters and the audience believe for a moment that something precious is gone. Only then can return become transformative. Aslan tells Lucy and Susan that the deeper magic works backward from death. What appeared final was not final. This is the turning point of the entire story. Until now, the children have been trying to survive Narnia. After Aslan's resurrection, they begin to understand that they have a responsibility to help save it. Aslan frees the prisoners from the witch's castle, while the armies prepare for battle. Peter assumes command, and the transformation that began with the wolf confrontation becomes complete. He is no longer simply the oldest brother trying to keep everyone safe. He is a leader responsible for people who trust him. Susan and Lucy fight in their own ways. Edmund, despite having once betrayed everyone, returns to the battlefield. His redemption becomes active rather than verbal. He does not erase his mistake. He proves through action that he has changed. When Edmund destroys the witch's weapon, he helps create the possibility of victory, but he is also seriously wounded. That detail matters. Redemption in Narnia is not cheap. It costs something. Peter confronts the witch, and the battle seems to tilt toward chaos until Aslan arrives. His entrance is not simply the arrival of a stronger fighter. It represents the return of the moral order that the witch had temporarily disrupted. The witch is defeated. Narnia is freed. And the children are crowned at Cair Paravel. On the surface, this is the classic fantasy ending. The heroes win. The kingdom celebrates. The children become kings and queens. But Narnia does something stranger. It lets them grow up. They live for years as rulers. They become adults inside this world. Even though their original bodies remain children outside it, they learn governance, responsibility, relationships, and the rhythms of a life that is completely different from the one they left behind. Then, while hunting the white stag, they discover the lamppost and the wardrobe again. They stumble through the doorway and become children once more. Their experience has vanished from the physical world, but it has not vanished from them. The wardrobe is once again an ordinary object. The professor understands more than the children initially realize. He does not dismiss the story. He simply recognizes that Narnia operates by rules that ordinary adults do not understand. The final implication is both comforting and unsettling. Narnia is not necessarily finished with them, and that idea prepares us for the deeper character question at the center of the story. What exactly did each child learn from entering it? The Pevensey siblings are often grouped together as heroes, but their individual arcs are much more interesting when separated. Lucy represents belief, but not belief in the simplistic sense of being cheerful or innocent. Her real strength is emotional courage. She is willing to trust her own experience, even when everyone around her says she is wrong. That makes her vulnerable, but it also makes her perceptive. Lucy understands Narnia before she understands its politics. She recognizes that Mr. Tumnus is afraid. She recognizes that the beavers are trustworthy. She recognizes Aslan's importance before she fully understands him. Her innocence is therefore not weakness. It is an openness to possibility. Peter represents responsibility. His initial instinct is to protect his siblings, but that instinct is mixed with uncertainty. He wants to be the older brother who knows what to do, even when he does not know what to do. Narnia forces him to confront that contradiction. Leadership means making decisions without certainty. It means being responsible for people who may be stronger, older, or more experienced than you. By the end, Peter is not courageous because he stops being afraid. He is courageous because responsibility becomes more important than fear. Susan is perhaps the most misunderstood of the four. Her skepticism is not cowardice. She is often the person who thinks about consequences before everyone else does. She carries a bow because she understands distance, patience, and observation. Her caution is a form of protection. But Narnia also exposes the danger of relying too heavily on certainty. If you require proof before allowing yourself to believe, you may protect yourself from disappointment while also protecting yourself from wonder. Edmund's arc is the most visibly dramatic because he falls the furthest. But his psychology is what makes the story work. He is insecure. He feels overlooked. He resents Peter. He wants recognition. The witch identifies those emotional wounds and exploits them. The Turkish delight works because it is attached to a promise. You can be important. You can have power. You can be seen. The real temptation is not the thing being offered. It is the identity being promised. That is why Edmund remains relatable. Most people will never be offered a throne by an evil witch, but many people know what it feels like to want approval badly enough to make a poor decision. Edmund's redemption therefore speaks to something deeply human. We all want to believe that our worst mistake is not the whole story of who we are. His relationship with Aslan becomes the emotional answer. Aslan does not deny Edmund's guilt. He simply refuses to let guilt become the final identity. Peter learns responsibility. Susan learns that caution needs openness. Lucy learns that belief can survive isolation. Edmund learns that forgiveness can create a second chance. Together, the siblings form four different responses to the uncertainty of growing up. The White Witch is equally interesting when she is viewed psychologically, rather than simply as a fantasy villain. Georgie does not merely want to defeat the Pevensies. She wants to control the conditions under which they exist. Her kingdom is frozen because her emotional philosophy is frozen. Nothing changes. Nothing grows. Nothing surprises her. Endless winter becomes an image of authoritarian certainty. Spring represents possibility, and possibility is dangerous to someone whose power depends on control. The witch therefore attacks possibility itself. She wants the prophecy to fail because prophecy represents a future she cannot command. She manipulates Edmund because she recognizes that he is already vulnerable. She does not need to invent his insecurity. She simply amplifies it. Her promise of Turkish delight is an early example of how her power works. She rewards selfishness and then converts the reward into dependence. Her authority is absolute because cooperation is not her goal. She wants obedience. This makes her a thematic opposite of Aslan. Aslan's power creates freedom. The witch's power creates fear. Aslan's strength includes sacrifice. The witch's strength depends on avoiding vulnerability. She cannot understand why someone would willingly give up power for another person. That is why Aslan's sacrifice defeats her philosophically before it defeats her physically. She understands law without understanding mercy. She understands punishment without understanding redemption. She understands control without understanding love. Her certainty makes her dangerous because she never has to ask whether she might be wrong. In that sense, she is also a mirror of Edmund. Edmund's selfishness is small and personal. Georgie's selfishness is political and absolute. Both believe that getting what they want will solve their insecurity. Both discover that control cannot produce genuine belonging. When the witch falls, winter does not simply disappear because a villain has been defeated. Possibility returns. Flowers bloom. The world becomes capable of change again. The supporting characters make Narnia feel like a moral universe rather than a playground. Mr. Tumnus is especially important because he is the first person to show Lucy that living under evil does not mean everyone becomes evil. He is frightened. He has orders. He is tempted to obey. But he chooses to protect someone weaker than himself. His courage is quiet, and because it is quiet, it feels believable. The beavers serve as guides, but they are more than exposition machines. They provide Lucy, Peter, Susan, and the audience with a bridge between the strange world they have entered and the larger conflict they do not yet understand. Professor Kirk plays a similar role from the other side of the wardrobe. He is an adult who understands that mystery does not need to be immediately explained away. When the children tell him about Narnia, his reaction is important because he recognizes that their experience may be real. He does not demand that everything fit neatly into ordinary logic. Mrs. Macready represents the opposite force. She is concerned with rules, order, and the practical management of the estate. Her presence reinforces the difference between the adult world of wartime Britain and the imaginative world the children discover. Father Christmas brings a moment of warmth and hope, but his appearance also functions as a symbolic announcement that the witch's winter is losing its permanence. Maugrim embodies the military arm of authoritarian power. Aureus and the other creatures represent resistance. The centaurs, fauns, giants, minotaurs, and talking animals create the feeling that Narnia has a population beyond the protagonists. This matters because fantasy can easily feel empty if every character exists only to move the heroes forward. Narnia feels inhabited because its creatures seem to have histories, fears, loyalties, and relationships that continue beyond the frame. Even the comic moments serve a purpose. The beavers provide warmth and humor without destroying the seriousness of the larger story. The talking animals make the world emotionally accessible because they translate the strange into something familiar. We may not understand Narnian politics, but we understand a frightened friend, a worried parent, a loyal guide, or someone trying to make dinner during a crisis. The supporting cast therefore gives Narnia emotional texture. They make the kingdom worth saving. Underneath the battles and mythology, the story is built around a surprisingly simple set of human problems. Temptation, betrayal, forgiveness, sacrifice, courage, leadership, faith, growing up. The reason these themes continue to work is that none of them require the audience to believe in magic. Edmund's temptation is recognizable because people understand immediate gratification. He wants something now and ignores the consequences later. His betrayal is powerful because it happens inside a family. The danger is not simply that an enemy is attacking from outside. The danger is that someone inside the group has opened the door. Forgiveness then becomes difficult because it is easy to forgive a stranger for something that does not matter. It is much harder to forgive someone you love for something that hurt you personally. Narnia argues that forgiveness does not mean pretending the betrayal never happened. It means refusing to allow the betrayal to control the future. Sacrifice becomes the highest expression of love, because Aslan does not sacrifice himself for someone who earned it. Edmund did not deserve the sacrifice in the conventional sense. That is exactly why it carries emotional power. Courage is similarly redefined. Courage is not Peter becoming fearless. It is Peter acting while afraid. It is Lucy trusting when she is isolated. It is Tumnus choosing kindness despite danger. Leadership is not privilege. The crowns the children receive are not rewards for being special. They are responsibilities. The story repeatedly asks what you will do when people depend on you. Faith is perhaps the most complicated theme because Narnia does not present belief as certainty. Lucy believes before she has evidence everyone else accepts. Susan hesitates. Edmund rejects what he knows when another desire becomes more attractive. The story understands that uncertainty is part of belief. And then there is the loss of innocence. The children cannot enter Narnia and return completely unchanged. They have seen death. They have made mistakes. They have fought. They have forgiven. They have been responsible for other people's lives. The fantasy world becomes a compressed version of growing up. That is why the story can speak to modern audiences, even when the explicitly Christian elements are unfamiliar. A child does not need to understand every theological reference to understand what it feels like to regret something, to be forgiven, to be afraid, or to discover that someone you trusted is willing to sacrifice for you. The theology gives those experiences a particular structure, but the emotional experiences themselves are universal. The visual symbolism reinforces these ideas long before the characters explain them. Narnia begins in white and gray. The snow is beautiful, but it is also oppressive. Winter has become permanent, and permanence is precisely the problem. Snow normally suggests a season. Here it has become a prison. The landscape is frozen because the society is frozen. Nothing can grow. Nothing can change. Warmth therefore becomes more than comfort. It becomes evidence of hope. The first signs of spring are emotional events because they indicate that the witch's control is no longer absolute. The lamppost functions as a symbol of transition. It is artificial light in a natural world, modernity inside mythology, a reminder that Narnia is connected to the ordinary world, even when it feels completely separate. The wardrobe itself is a threshold. It is made from ordinary material but contains extraordinary possibility. That is one reason the image remains so powerful. You do not need a portal glowing with energy. You need a door that could exist in any house. The stone table represents law, death, sacrifice, and the possibility of transformation. Cair Paravel represents the opposite end of the emotional journey. It is the place where the children become rulers, but it is also the place they eventually leave. The witch's castle is full of stone and imprisonment. It reflects her desire to turn living beings into permanent objects. Aslan's presence changes the visual atmosphere because he brings movement and scale. His body is warm, textured, organic. He looks like a living creature rather than a frozen symbol. Weapons also carry meaning. Peter's sword represents responsibility. Susan's bow represents distance and precision. Lucy's cordial represents healing. Her dagger represents the fact that innocence does not eliminate the need for self-defense. Costumes evolve as the children become rulers. They stop looking like visitors and begin to look like people who belong. Even the changing landscape tells the story. Snow melts. Water moves. Flowers return. Nature becomes an external representation of moral possibility. The movie repeatedly uses light and shadow to establish emotional conditions before dialogue explains them. Imprisonment is dark. Release is expansive. The witch's world is rigid. Aslan's world is alive. The visual language is therefore not decorative. It is narrative. The deeper architecture becomes more complicated when we consider the Christian parallels surrounding Aslan. The stone table, the sacrificial death, the innocent substitute, the return from death, and the confrontation between death and a deeper law all clearly echo Christian theology. But reducing Narnia to a simple one-to-one allegory can actually make the story less interesting. Lewis himself preferred the idea of supposal. Rather than writing a direct allegory where every character has to equal a specific theological concept, he imagined what Christian truth might look like if it existed in another world. That distinction gives Narnia room to remain fantasy. Aslan is not merely Jesus with a lion's face. He is Aslan. The mythology works on its own terms, while also carrying theological resonance. The deep magic creates a moral order that even the witch recognizes. But the deeper magic reveals that the moral universe is larger than the witch's understanding of justice. This introduces a philosophical question about law. Can evil understand rules without understanding the purpose behind them? Can someone use justice as a weapon while remaining blind to mercy? The witch believes the law proves her right. Aslan demonstrates that law is not the deepest reality. Sacrifice is. Love is. Free will also matters. The prophecy seems to suggest that the Pevensies have a predetermined role, but they still make meaningful choices. Edmund chooses betrayal. Tumnus chooses mercy. Peter chooses courage. Aslan chooses sacrifice. Prophecy does not eliminate responsibility. It creates a framework in which choices still matter. This is part of what makes Aslan's vulnerability so important. If he simply defeated the witch through superior strength, the story would become a conventional battle between stronger and weaker forces. By allowing himself to die, he demonstrates a different definition of power. True power can choose restraint. True strength can accept vulnerability. Evil can exploit law, but it cannot understand why someone would voluntarily suffer for another person. That is the philosophical core of the story. It also explains why the filmmakers had to preserve the emotional weight of the stone table, even while adapting the material for a mainstream audience. If that sequence became merely another action scene, the architecture would collapse. The audience had to feel the silence before understanding the symbolism. Creating that world required a mixture of practical craftsmanship and digital technology. Weta Workshop's involvement helped give Narnia a tactile quality that remains important to its visual identity. Costumes, creature designs, armor, props, prosthetics, and practical elements gave the fantasy world physical texture. That texture matters because digital creatures exist in danger of looking weightless. A creature can be technically impressive and still fail emotionally if it does not appear to occupy the same physical environment as the actors around it. Aslan was one of the largest challenges. He had to be believable as a lion while also functioning as an expressive actor. His face needed subtle emotional movement. His mane needed to respond naturally. His body needed believable weight. His interactions with the children needed to feel physically present. Talking animals created another problem. The audience had to accept that these creatures were speaking without allowing the lip movement to become distracting. Centaurs presented an entirely different challenge because their anatomy had to combine human and animal movement. Minotaurs, giants, fauns, wolves, and other creatures each required their own visual logic. Practical effects could provide textures and costumes, while digital effects could expand scale, alter environments, and create impossible movements. The winter landscapes were also carefully designed to feel like a real place, rather than a digital backdrop. The stone table sequence needed a sense of physical weight, because its emotional meaning depended on the audience believing that this was an ancient, permanent object. The Battle of Baruna pushed the technology further, requiring hundreds of creatures and soldiers to occupy a coherent battlefield. In the early 2000s, visual effects were already capable of extraordinary things, but they had not reached the seamless level audiences now take for granted. Some effects inevitably reveal their age. Certain digital creatures can look softer than they would in modern productions. Some battle composites lack the physical density of contemporary effects. Yet the film's practical textures often protect it from feeling entirely artificial. That is one reason Narnia remains visually recognizable. It was built with enough real material that the digital elements had something tangible to belong to. The effects were not simply trying to impress. They were trying to make the impossible feel inhabited. Andrew Adamson's direction is defined by balance. Coming from animation, he understood the importance of visual clarity and character expression, but Narnia required him to control a much larger emotional range. The film had to contain humor without becoming a comedy, darkness without becoming grim, spectacle without becoming empty, and innocence without becoming childish. The children's perspective became the anchor. We discover Narnia with Lucy. We become skeptical with Peter and Susan. We experience the witch's manipulation through Edmund. This prevents the movie from becoming an encyclopedia of its own mythology. The audience learns the world because the children learn the world. Adamson also made a significant choice in treating the witch as genuinely threatening. She is not a cartoon villain who can be defeated through a joke. Her presence creates danger before she ever enters a major battle. The decision to expand the action also reflects the demands of blockbuster filmmaking. The book contains battles, but the film had to make those battles cinematic. Peter's sword fight and the final confrontation give the audience physical manifestations of the characters' internal transformations. Yet the intimate scenes remain important. Tumnus and Lucy, Edmund and the witch, Aslan and Edmund, Susan and Lucy at the stone table. These quieter scenes give the spectacle meaning. Without them, the battles would simply be movement. The adaptation also expands certain action elements and adjusts pacing to create a more conventional cinematic structure. That creates some of the film's weaknesses, particularly when exposition interrupts momentum, but it also makes the story accessible to viewers who have never read the books. Adamson's greatest achievement may be that he allows Narnia to feel serious without becoming solemn. There are moments of humor and warmth because the children remain children. They argue. They tease each other. They make mistakes. That emotional texture keeps the fantasy grounded. The world can be enormous, but the story remains about four siblings. Music becomes another essential bridge between the ordinary and the extraordinary. Harry Gregson Williams's score gives Narnia a musical identity that changes as the children change. Early cues often emphasize mystery and discovery. The music does not immediately announce that the children are heroes. It lets the audience wonder. As the story expands, orchestration becomes larger, percussion becomes more forceful, and choral textures create a sense of mythology. Aslan's musical identity carries weight without needing constant repetition. His themes tend to feel expansive and emotionally elevated, reinforcing the idea that his presence changes the scale of the world. Lucy's musical material often feels more delicate, because her emotional role is associated with openness and wonder. The witch's music, by contrast, leans toward darker textures and menace. The battle sequences use percussion and large orchestral forces to create physical momentum. But perhaps the most important musical decision occurs around the stone table. There, restraint becomes more powerful than volume. Silence and sparse orchestration create space for grief. The audience is not told how to react through constant musical manipulation. The score allows the emotional emptiness of the moment to exist. Then, when Aslan returns, the music can expand again because hope has become earned. The final battle benefits from this accumulated musical vocabulary. The audience does not simply hear a generic heroic soundtrack. They hear the musical consequences of everything that came before. That is why the score contributes so strongly to nostalgia. Sometimes remembering a movie is less about remembering dialogue than remembering the feeling created by a piece of music. A particular orchestral swell can bring back the image of snow, the sound of the wardrobe door, the sight of Aslan walking toward the stone table. Music stores emotional memory differently from dialogue. It bypasses explanation and returns directly to feeling. Sound design performs a similar function on a more physical level. The contrast between Britain and Narnia begins acoustically. Britain is filled with the mechanical sounds of war, aircraft, alarms, and human infrastructure. Narnia is filled with wind, forests, footsteps in snow, animal calls, distant movement, and the strange acoustics of open landscapes. The witch has a supernatural presence that can be communicated through sound before she even speaks. Creatures need individual vocal identities. Wolves should sound dangerous but not generic. Magical beings should feel connected to the physical world. Battles need weight. Swords should clash. Arrows should cut through air. Armor should move. Horses and other animals should sound like living bodies rather than sound effects placed over images. Silence becomes equally important. Around Aslan's death, the reduction of sound creates emotional intimacy. The audience is forced to listen to small movements, rather than the noise of an epic fantasy. This sonic contrast helps the movie bridge realism and fantasy. We may accept a talking animal because the surrounding world sounds physically believable. Sound also creates anticipation. A distant roar, the movement of soldiers, the sudden absence of birds, or the change in wind can signal danger before the audience sees its source. The relationship between music and sound effects becomes especially important during battles. Music creates emotional scale while sound creates physical scale. One tells us why the battle matters. The other tells us that the battle is happening. Songs placed around the movie and its end credits contribute another layer of identity, connecting the film to the broader popular music culture of the era. The result is an audio world that extends beyond the frame. Even when the screen is quiet, the audience feels that Narnia continues to exist somewhere beyond what the camera can see. When The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe arrived during the Christmas season of 2005, it entered popular culture as more than another fantasy release. Families went together. Fans of the books wanted to see how the world looked. Fantasy audiences wanted another large-scale adventure. Children saw talking animals and magical kingdoms. Adults recognized a story they may have encountered in school or through their own childhood. Aslan quickly became the visual symbol of the movie. The White Witch became another instantly recognizable image, with Tilda Swinton's pale appearance and icy costume design turning her into a figure associated with the film, even for people who had never read the books. The Turkish delight became an unlikely cultural reference point. The candy itself was already part of the original story, but the movie gave it a new association for a generation of viewers who began thinking of it as the Narnia candy. Merchandise followed naturally. Toys, costumes, books, games, collectibles, and promotional materials extended the world beyond the theater. The movie also became part of the larger conversation about which fantasy franchise would define the era. Harry Potter was still expanding. The Lord of the Rings had recently concluded its monumental trilogy. Narnia offers something different. It was shorter, more family-centered, more overtly mythic, and deeply connected to a classic children's literary tradition. Importantly, the movie reached beyond explicitly Christian audiences. Some viewers were drawn to the mythology. Others loved the family story. Others simply wanted a magical adventure. The symbolism could operate on multiple levels. That flexibility helped the film become culturally durable. Online discussions amplified this process. Fans debated the characters, the witch, Aslan, the meaning of the ending, the differences between the book and the film, and the symbolism of Edmund's betrayal. The internet was becoming a major part of fandom culture during this period, and Narnia benefited from that environment. It was a story that invited interpretation. The more people discussed it, the more layers seemed available. Its long-term survival, however, is more interesting than its immediate success. A movie can be a blockbuster and still disappear from cultural memory. Narnia did not. For many people, the first film became attached to a specific period of childhood. The DVD era was especially important. Before streaming became the dominant way audiences revisited movies, DVDs could sit on a family shelf for years. Children could watch the same movie repeatedly. They could grow up with the same characters. That repetition creates a different kind of relationship from a one-time theatrical experience. Later, streaming introduced Narnia to new viewers who had no memory of the original release. Online fandom gave older viewers a place to revisit the story. Fan theories, character discussions, memes, video essays, and retrospective rankings kept the movie circulating. The books continued to introduce new generations to the world, even when the film franchise was no longer moving forward at the same speed. Aslan remained the emotional center. The wardrobe remained one of the most recognizable portals in fantasy. Edmund's story continued to invite debate, because people could interpret his betrayal differently depending on their own experiences. The first film also became the defining cinematic Narnia experience for many viewers because later entries did not recreate the same combination of novelty, emotional simplicity, and cultural timing. There is something difficult to reproduce about being introduced to a world for the first time. The first snowfall. The first appearance of the lamppost. The first time Lucy meets Tumnus. The first time Aslan appears. Nostalgia does not simply preserve quality, it preserves the emotional circumstances under which you encountered something. That is why an adult rewatch can feel strangely different. The movie has not changed, but the viewer has. Edmund may no longer seem like an annoying younger brother. He may look like a frightened child who wanted recognition. Susan's skepticism may feel less frustrating and more understandable. Peter's leadership may feel less heroic and more exhausting. Aslan's sacrifice may become more emotionally difficult, because adults understand loss differently than children do. The story becomes a mirror, and the reflection changes with age. This is also where the difference between critics and audiences becomes important. A film can be imperfect in structure and still be emotionally effective. Critics often praise the production design, performances, visual effects, and the central performances of Tilda Swinton, and the voice work behind Aslan. At the same time, some criticism focused on pacing, exposition, tonal transitions, and the conventional structure of the action. Compared with The Lord of the Rings, Narnia could feel less sophisticated in its world building. Compared with Harry Potter, it could feel more mythic and less grounded in a continuing school year structure. Some viewers found the Christian symbolism powerful. Others found it too obvious. Some audiences embraced the family-friendly tone. Others felt that the movie struggled to reconcile children's fantasy with battlefield violence. All of these reactions can coexist. A movie does not have to be flawless to become emotionally important. In fact, nostalgia often reveals a distinction between technical evaluation and personal experience. Someone can recognize that a scene is awkwardly paced and still feel deeply moved when the music begins. Someone can criticize the exposition and still remember exactly how they felt when Aslan returned. The important question is not whether fans are wrong to love a film critics found uneven. The question is what emotional mechanism allowed the film to survive those imperfections. Narnia's strongest moments are strong because they connect spectacle to character. Edmund's redemption matters because we understand the insecurity that caused his betrayal. Aslan's sacrifice matters because we know what Edmund did. Peter's battle matters because we watched him struggle with responsibility. Lucy's belief matters because we saw her isolated before anyone else accepted Narnia. When emotional cause and cinematic effect align, the audience can forgive conventional storytelling. That does not erase flaws, but it explains why technical criticism and audience affection can exist side by side. The controversies surrounding Narnia are similarly more interesting when they are examined without reducing them to simple arguments. The Christian symbolism is the most obvious debate. Some viewers see the film as a powerful expression of Christian ideas. Others see it as religious messaging embedded inside a fantasy story. The reality is more complicated because Lewis's Christianity was not a surface decoration. It shaped the imaginative architecture of his work. At the same time, Narnia is not a direct theological textbook. The story uses myth, fairy tale, adventure, and symbolism to create emotional experiences that can be understood at different levels. Adaptation choices created another area of debate. The filmmakers expanded action and gave certain battles more cinematic emphasis than the book requires. This makes sense commercially and visually, but it also changes the rhythm of the story. A novel can move quickly through a battle, or allow the reader's imagination to construct it. A movie must fill the screen. Some viewers appreciated the additions because they made Narnia feel like an epic. Others felt that the additions pushed the film toward a more conventional Hollywood structure. The violence also created a tonal tension. This is a movie about children talking animals and magical gifts, yet it contains death, imprisonment, torture, and war. That tension is not necessarily a flaw. It is part of what makes Narnia distinctive, but it can feel uneven when the movie moves quickly between whimsical comedy and serious violence. Edmund's redemption also raises questions about how much responsibility the story expects children to carry. His betrayal is severe, but the narrative allows forgiveness because it distinguishes between the seriousness of an action and the possibility of transformation. The broader literary franchise introduces even more complicated questions, particularly around Susan's later arc in the books, and what it means to lose or reject Narnia. Those questions become part of the larger conversation about whether the films fully captured Lewis's worldview. A balanced evaluation has to admit that modernization can make a classic accessible, while also changing its emphasis. The challenge is deciding whether the change strengthens the cinematic experience, or merely makes the material look more familiar. Narnia does both at different moments. From a business perspective, the first film was a major Hollywood experiment that appeared to have everything necessary for franchise success. The production represented a substantial investment, but the worldwide box office demonstrated that the audience was there. The holiday release strategy gave it a long theatrical runway and positioned the movie as a family event rather than a niche fantasy film. That matters economically because family audiences can create repeat viewing, group attendance, and merchandise opportunities. The literary IP gave the studio an existing audience, while the creatures, weapons, costumes, and characters created obvious merchandising potential. Home entertainment extended the revenue cycle. The first film therefore looked like the beginning of something much larger. The challenge was that franchise success is not simply about making one profitable movie. It is about reproducing cultural momentum. The relationship between Disney and Walden Media became part of that larger business story. Prince Caspian faced the difficult task of following a film that had introduced Narnia to a huge audience, while also changing the tone and scale. The first movie had the novelty of discovery. The second had to deepen the world. Marketing expectations changed. Audience tastes changed. The fantasy market became more crowded. The cultural moment that had helped the first movie was already moving. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader faced another transition in studio involvement, and continued the challenge of keeping Narnia commercially relevant. International performance demonstrated that the property still had value, but the franchise no longer felt inevitable. Planned future adaptations became increasingly uncertain. This is an important lesson in Hollywood franchise management. A successful first film creates expectations that later films may not be able to satisfy. Audiences want more of what they loved, but they also want escalation. Too much familiarity can feel repetitive. Too much change can feel like betrayal. Narnia struggled with that balance. The first movie had established a specific emotional identity, and reproducing that identity across different stories was difficult. The franchise stalled not because the world lacked material, but because cultural momentum is fragile. A property can have 7 books and still fail to become a 7-film cinematic institution. That makes Narnia's historical significance more complicated than its sequel performance might suggest. The first film stands beside Harry Potter and The Lord of the Rings as part of the early 21st century fantasy boom. It demonstrated that classic children's literature could become large-scale blockbuster cinema without abandoning its emotional center. Its production design, costumes, creature work, and effects contributed to the visual language of fantasy filmmaking during the period. Its recognition during awards season further confirmed that the film was being treated as a serious production, rather than disposable children's entertainment. Aslan became a cultural image that exists beyond the movie itself. For many young viewers, Narnia served as a gateway into fantasy literature. A child who saw the movie might then pick up the books. A reader who loved Lewis might discover other fantasy writers. The franchise also helped normalize the idea that children's stories could contain serious moral and philosophical ideas without needing to apologize for them. Its legacy, therefore, cannot be measured only by how many sequels were produced. A franchise can be commercially incomplete and culturally significant at the same time. Narnia's influence is partly invisible, because it exists in memories, reading habits, and the expectations audiences now have for fantasy adaptations. It showed that a story written for children could be treated with blockbuster scale, while still allowing children to remain the emotional center. It also demonstrated the difficulty of adapting a work whose worldview is deeply connected to its author. That challenge would become increasingly relevant as Hollywood continued adapting beloved literary properties. Rewatching Narnia years later also creates an unavoidable question: what has aged and what has not? The wardrobe concept remains almost impossible to date because its emotional appeal is timeless. Every generation understands the fantasy of discovering a secret door in an ordinary place. Edmund's temptation remains recognizable because insecurity does not belong to one decade. Aslan's sacrifice remains powerful because grief and forgiveness do not become obsolete. The witch's visual design is still striking because it is built around simplicity. White hair, pale skin, icy clothing, controlled movement. She does not need excessive visual noise to appear dangerous. Practical costumes and physical textures remain surprisingly effective. Some digital effects, however, reveal their early 2000s origins. Modern audiences have become accustomed to more advanced rendering, simulation, and compositing. Certain creatures may look less seamless now than they did in 2005. Battle choreography can also feel more conventional when compared with later fantasy productions that inherited decades of experimentation. Some dialogue and exposition carry the style of family adventure films from the period. The movie sometimes explains things that modern audiences might prefer to discover through visual storytelling. Yet nostalgia complicates the judgment. The very qualities that date the movie can also be the qualities that make it recognizable. The color grading, costumes, orchestral style, and effects carry the visual fingerprint of a particular cinematic era. They remind viewers of when they first saw it. More importantly, the emotional architecture remains intact. A child watching today can still understand Lucy's excitement. They can still feel Edmund's jealousy. They can still fear the witch. They can still grieve at the stone table. That is the difference between something dated and something obsolete. Narnia is dated in places, but it is not obsolete. Its technology belongs to 2005. Its central questions do not. So where does that leave the film itself? The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is not a perfect adaptation, and pretending otherwise would actually make its achievements less interesting. Its exposition can be heavy. Some transitions move too quickly or too conventionally. The action structure occasionally feels designed around the expectations of blockbuster fantasy, rather than the rhythm of Lewis's original storytelling. Some CGI has inevitably aged, yet its strongest elements remain unusually powerful. The Pevensey children feel like children rather than miniature superheroes. Tilda Swinton's White Witch is iconic because she combines beauty, cruelty, and emotional emptiness. Aslan carries enormous symbolic weight while still functioning as a character. The production design creates a world that feels tactile. The score gives the movie a musical identity that many viewers still remember instantly. And the emotional climax at the stone table remains the point where all of those elements converge. The film understands that fantasy only matters when something real is at stake. A magical kingdom without emotional consequences is just scenery. Narnia gives the scenery meaning by making the characters responsible for what happens there. That is why a modern rewatch is worthwhile. Not because every technical element has survived unchanged, but because the movie offers something that many contemporary blockbusters struggle to provide. A fantasy adventure whose spectacle is inseparable from moral transformation. If the film has weaknesses, they are mostly structural. If it has strengths, they are emotional and thematic. And emotional strengths tend to age better than technical ones. A digital creature can look dated. A sincere moment of forgiveness does not. A battle technique can feel old-fashioned. The fear of losing someone you love does not. A visual effect can reveal its limitations. The feeling of walking through a wardrobe and discovering a world where nothing is what it seems remains almost impossible to date.